April 1945, Zwolle, Netherlands. The ancient Dutch city sat trapped like a bird in a cage. 50,000 civilians huddled in their cellars and attics, waiting for the battle they knew was coming. Outside their windows, 300 German soldiers prepared their final defense. The Nazis had already wired the bridges with explosives. They had placed machine gun nests on every major street corner. Their orders were clear: fight to the last man, and if retreat became necessary, burn the city to the ground. The Canadian Army had surrounded Zwolle for 3 days. Their commanders studied maps in a farmhouse 2 miles south of the city. They counted the German positions. They calculated how many troops they would need. The math was simple and brutal. To take a city of this size, defended by entrenched soldiers, military doctrine required a full battalion assault. That meant 800 men minimum. It meant artillery bombardment to soften the defenses. It meant tanks rolling through narrow medieval streets. It meant house-to-house fighting that could last for days. The generals knew what this would cost. Allied intelligence estimated 200 to 400 civilian deaths, maybe more if the Germans decided to use the population as shields. The city itself would suffer catastrophic damage. At least 60% of the buildings would be destroyed or heavily damaged by artillery fire and street combat. The beautiful bridges that had stood for centuries would be rubble. The churches, the schools, the homes where Dutch families had lived for generations would become battlefields. But there was no other way. Every military manual said so. Every tactical expert agreed. You could not take a defended city without overwhelming force. The assault was scheduled to begin in 48 hours. The artillery batteries were already moving into position. Soldiers checked their weapons and wrote letters home. They all knew that urban warfare was the deadliest kind of fighting. Some of them would not survive the next 2 days. In a tent at the edge of the Canadian encampment, a soldier sat cleaning his Sten gun. His name was Corporal Léo Major. He was 24 years old and small for a soldier, just 5 feet 8 inches tall. When he looked up from his work, people noticed something strange about his face. His left eye was gone, destroyed by a phosphorus grenade at Normandy Beach 11 months earlier. The doctors had wanted to send him home. Major had refused. He taped a patch over the ruined eye and returned to his unit. His commanders thought he was crazy. His fellow soldiers whispered that he had a death wish. Major was a French-Canadian from Montreal. He had grown up poor, the son of a factory worker. He spoke with a thick accent that other soldiers sometimes mocked. Before the war, he had worked odd jobs and gotten into fights. The army had not wanted him at first. They said he was too small, too rough, too much trouble. But the war needed bodies, so they took him anyway. Now, after 3 years of combat, Major had earned a reputation. He volunteered for the most dangerous reconnaissance missions. He worked alone or with just one partner, slipping behind enemy lines to gather intelligence. He had a strange talent for moving through the darkness unseen, for reading the landscape, for sensing where the enemy would be. The other scouts respected him, but the officers did not trust him. Major did not follow orders the way a good soldier should. He talked back. He questioned tactics. He had strong opinions about how battles should be fought. Just last week, he had refused to accept the Distinguished Conduct Medal from Field Marshal Montgomery himself. The entire division had been shocked. Major said Montgomery was incompetent and did not deserve to give medals to real soldiers. The incident had almost gotten him court-martialed. Now, as Major sat in his tent, listening to the preparations for the Zwolle assault, his mind worked on a different problem. He had spent the last 3 nights observing the German positions from the woods outside the city. He had counted the sentries. He had timed their patrol routes. He had watched how they moved, how they communicated, how they reacted to small noises in the darkness. What he saw told him something important. The German garrison was scared. They were tired. They knew the war was almost over. They knew the Allies had won. These were not the fanatical SS troops who would fight to the death. These were regular soldiers who wanted to survive long enough to go home. Major realized something that his commanders had missed. The Germans in Zwolle were not waiting to fight. They were waiting for an excuse to run. They expected a massive assault because that was how battles were supposed to work. But what if there was no massive assault? What if, instead of 800 men attacking from every direction, one man slipped into the city in the darkness? What if that one man made enough noise, caused enough chaos, created enough fear that the Germans thought they were already surrounded? What if the key to taking Zwolle was not overwhelming force, but overwhelming deception? Major stood up and walked to the command tent. The officers looked up in surprise when he entered. He was just a corporal, not supposed to be in meetings with captains and majors, but he had done this before. He cleared his throat and spoke in his rough French accent. He said he could take Zwolle alone. Tonight. With 0 civilian casualties, no artillery, no tanks, no battalion assault. Just him, and maybe one other scout. They would slip into the city at 3 in the morning, create the illusion of a full attack, and scare the Germans into retreat before sunrise. The room went silent. Then the officers started laughing. One captain said it was the stupidest idea he had ever heard. Another said, Major's head injury from Normandy must have been worse than anyone thought. The senior officer shook his head and told Major to get out and stop wasting their time. The assault would proceed as planned. That was final. Major stood there for a moment, his one good eye staring at the maps on the table. Then he turned and walked out without saluting. Major did not give up. He found the one person in the entire regiment who might listen to him. Corporal Willie Arsenault was another French-Canadian scout who had worked with Major on dozens of missions. They understood each other without needing many words. That evening, Major laid out his plan. They would enter Zwolle at exactly 3 in the morning when human alertness was at its lowest point. They would carry only light weapons. Major would bring his Sten gun with 6 magazines, 30 rounds each. He would carry 8 grenades, half of them captured German stick grenades. Arsenault would carry the same loadout. The total weight of ammunition and explosives for both men was 42 pounds. The key to the plan was movement and noise. They would not try to kill every German soldier in the city. That was impossible. Instead, they would attack from different locations every 30 minutes. They would fire bursts from one street corner, then run 3 blocks away and attack from a completely different direction. They would throw grenades into German positions and disappear before the enemy could organize a response. They would use the captured German grenades specifically because when they exploded, German soldiers would think their own weapons were being used against them. This would create fear and confusion. It would make the garrison believe they were facing commandos who had infiltrated deep into their positions. Arsenault listened to the whole plan. Then he smiled and said he was in. But they needed official permission. Going into the city without orders would be desertion. Major thought about this for a moment. Then he went back to the command tent and asked for permission to conduct a reconnaissance patrol. Just 2 men. They would gather intelligence about German strength and positions for the main assault. The officers agreed. Reconnaissance was normal. They had no idea what Major actually intended to do. At midnight, Major and Arsenault prepared their gear. They blackened their faces with charcoal. They removed anything that would reflect light or make noise. No dog tags jingling. No metal canteens rattling. They checked their weapons 3 times each. The Sten gun was a simple weapon, weighing just 6 pounds, with a 30-round magazine and a rate of fire of 550 rounds per minute. It was not accurate past 50 yards, but for close urban combat, it was perfect. They synchronized their watches. The plan required precise timing. At 2:30 in the morning, they crossed the fields outside Zwolle. The night was cold and moonless. They could barely see 10 feet ahead. This was good. The darkness was their ally. They reached the outskirts of the city at exactly 3 o'clock. The streets were silent except for the sound of German boots on patrol. Major counted the sentries as they walked past. He memorized their routes. He waited until the patrol turned a corner. Then he and Arsenault slipped between 2 houses and entered the city. For the first 20 minutes they moved like ghosts. They stayed in the shadows. They avoided the main streets. They made no sound. Major was looking for the perfect spot to begin. He found it at 3:20, a German machine gun position at an intersection, manned by 4 soldiers. 1 was asleep. 2 were smoking cigarettes. The fourth was half awake, watching the empty street with tired eyes. Major and Arsenault crept within 30 yards of the position. Major raised his Sten gun and fired a full magazine in 3-second bursts. The sound shattered the silence like breaking glass. 30 rounds tore through the sandbags. 2 German soldiers fell. The others scrambled for cover, shouting in panic. Major dropped a grenade over the sandbags and ran. The explosion lit up the intersection in orange fire. Then he and Arsenault were gone, racing down an alley 3 blocks to the north. Behind them, the entire German garrison woke up. Whistles blew. Officers shouted orders. Boots pounded on cobblestones. Flashlights swept the darkness. But Major and Arsenault were already setting up their next attack. This time they hit a supply depot on the eastern edge of the city. Major threw 2 German stick grenades through a window. The distinctive handles made a specific sound when they tumbled through the air. When they exploded, the German soldiers inside heard their own weapons being used against them. They started shooting wildly into the darkness, convinced that commandos had somehow gotten behind their lines. For the next hour, Major and Arsenault moved like phantoms through Zwolle. They attacked from the north, then the south, then the west. They never stayed in one place longer than 2 minutes. They fired from windows, from rooftops, from alleyways. Each attack was separated by exactly 30 to 40 minutes, just enough time to make the Germans think multiple teams were operating independently. The plan was working perfectly. Then everything went wrong. At 4:15 in the morning, they encountered a German patrol in a narrow street. There was no time to hide, no room to maneuver. Arsenault opened fire first. His Sten gun cut down 2 soldiers, but a third German had a machine pistol. He sprayed bullets across the street. Arsenault took 3 rounds in the chest. He fell without making a sound. Major killed the German and dragged Arsenault into a doorway. His friend was already dead. Blood soaked the cobblestones. Major knelt there for 30 seconds, breathing hard, his mind racing. The smart thing to do was retreat. Report back to base. Tell them the mission had failed. But if he retreated now, the full assault would proceed. 800 men. Artillery bombardment. Thousands of civilians trapped in the crossfire. Everything he had tried to prevent would happen anyway. Major made his decision. He took Arsenault's ammunition and grenades. He whispered a quick prayer in French. Then he stood up and continued alone. The next 2 hours became a blur of violence and movement. Major attacked German positions with a fury that bordered on madness. He was no longer trying to be subtle. He was trying to create maximum chaos. He fired his Sten gun until the barrel grew hot. He threw grenades until his arm ached. He screamed in the darkness, sometimes in French, sometimes in broken German, making it sound like there were many voices, many attackers. At 5 o'clock in the morning, he captured his first prisoner, a German SS officer stumbling through an alley, separated from his unit. Major pressed the Sten gun against his head and forced him to walk to a building with a working telephone. He made the officer call the German garrison command. The officer, terrified and confused by the chaos erupting across the city, reported that Allied forces had infiltrated Zwolle in overwhelming numbers. He estimated at least 50 to 100 commandos attacking from multiple directions. He said the situation was hopeless. He said they needed to retreat immediately or be surrounded and destroyed. Major listened to the conversation through the receiver. He heard the panic in the German commander's voice. The psychological warfare was working. The entire garrison believed they were facing a massive Allied operation. They had no idea it was just one angry Canadian with a Sten gun and a dead friend to avenge. By 7 o'clock in the morning, the German garrison in Zwolle was falling apart. Soldiers ran through the streets in small groups, no longer organized into proper units. They had spent 4 hours listening to gunfire and explosions coming from every direction. They had watched their comrades fall to invisible attackers. They had heard reports of commandos infiltrating deep behind their lines. Every shadow seemed to hide an enemy. Every sound made them jump. The psychological pressure had broken them. The German commander gave the order to retreat. It was not a tactical withdrawal. It was a panicked flight. Trucks loaded with supplies roared out of the city heading east. Soldiers abandoned their positions without waiting for orders. Machine gun nests that had been carefully positioned for weeks were left unmanned. The explosives wired to the bridges sat unused. Nobody took the time to blow them up. The only thought in every German soldier's mind was to get out of Zwolle before the Allied commandos surrounded them completely. Major watched from a rooftop as the evacuation began. His uniform was torn and covered in brick dust. His face was black with gunpowder. His one good eye was bloodshot from lack of sleep. He had been fighting alone for 4 straight hours. He had moved through more than 20 different locations across the city. His Sten gun was so hot from continuous firing that he had wrapped his jacket around the barrel. He had gone through all of his ammunition and had resupplied by taking magazines from dead German soldiers. Now he watched as his impossible plan actually worked, but the Germans were not finished yet. At 8:30 in the morning, reinforcements arrived from the eastern suburbs. 2 companies of German troops, more than 200 men, were counterattacking to retake the city. They had armored vehicles and heavy machine guns. They advanced down the main boulevard in formation, exactly the way military doctrine said you should recapture urban territory. They expected to face the large Allied force that had supposedly infiltrated Zwolle during the night. Instead, they faced one exhausted Canadian corporal. Major saw them coming. He had maybe 30 rounds of ammunition left. Fighting 200 fresh troops was suicide. But if he let them retake the city, everything he had done would be worthless. All the civilians would still be trapped. The full Allied assault would still happen. Arsenage would have died for nothing. Major made the only choice he could. He started shooting. He hit them from the 2nd floor of a bakery on the main street. The first burst of gunfire killed the lead officer. The German column stopped in confusion. They could not see where the shots came from. Major fired again and moved to a different window. He was using the same tactic that had worked all night. Make them think there were multiple shooters. Create chaos and fear. Keep moving so they could never pin him down. For the next 3 hours, Major fought a running battle across 12 city blocks. He would fire from one building, then race through alleys and backyards to another position. The Germans tried to surround him, but he moved too fast. They tried to flush him out with grenades, but he was always somewhere else by the time the explosives went off. He led them on a chase through the ancient streets of Zwolle, using every trick he had learned in 3 years of combat. The civilians of Zwolle heard the battle raging through their city. They huddled in their basements and listened to the gunfire echoing off the old brick buildings. But something was different from what they expected. There was no artillery bombardment, no tank cannons destroying buildings, no sound of hundreds of soldiers fighting house to house. Just rifle fire and the occasional grenade. The battle sounded smaller than it should be, quieter, more contained. By 11 o'clock, the German counterattack collapsed. Major had killed or wounded more than 30 of the reinforcement troops. The rest retreated east in disorder, convinced they were facing a superior force. The psychological advantage that had broken the original garrison now broke the reinforcements too. They had no idea they were running from a single man. At noon, an eerie silence fell over Zwolle. For the first time in days, there was no gunfire, no explosions, no shouted orders in German. Major stood in the city center, surrounded by the bodies of German soldiers he had killed. His Sten gun was empty. Every grenade was gone. He was swaying on his feet from exhaustion, but the city was quiet. Slowly, doors began to open. Dutch civilians emerged from their hiding places. They stepped out of cellars into the sunlight. They looked around in amazement. Their city still stood. The beautiful medieval buildings were intact. The bridges had not been destroyed. The churches and schools were undamaged. Yes, there were bullet holes in some walls. Yes, there were broken windows and scorch marks from grenades. But compared to what everyone had expected, Zwolle was a miracle. The city had survived. An old woman was the first to approach Major. She stared at the strange soldier with one eye and a torn uniform, standing alone among the dead Germans. She asked in broken English how many Allied soldiers had liberated the city. Major looked at her with his exhausted eye and said in his thick French accent that it was just him. Only him. He had promised he would liberate Zwolle alone, and he had done it. More civilians gathered. They could not believe what they were hearing. One man counted the German bodies in the streets. 93 dead, many more wounded. Hundreds had fled in panic, all because of one soldier. The Dutch people began to understand what had happened. This Canadian had saved their city. He had prevented the artillery bombardment that would have killed hundreds of them. He had stopped the street fighting that would have turned their homes into rubble. The numbers told an incredible story. The original Allied assault plan had estimated 200 to 400 civilian deaths, but there were 0. The military planners had calculated that 60% of the city's buildings would be destroyed or heavily damaged, yet every building stood intact. The cost of the conventional assault in Allied casualties alone would have been 40 to 70 soldiers killed. Major had done it with just himself and Arsenault, paying the terrible price of one friend's life. But perhaps the most unexpected consequence was what the fleeing Germans left behind. In their panic, they abandoned massive quantities of supplies. Ammunition crates sat unopened in warehouses. Food supplies enough to feed the garrison for weeks lay scattered in storage depots. Vehicles were left with keys still in the ignition. Most valuable of all were the classified documents. German officers had fled without destroying their papers. Maps showing defensive positions across the entire region, communication codes, lists of collaborators, intelligence that would help the Allied advance for weeks to come. Major barely noticed any of this. He sat down on the steps of the city hall, his Sten gun across his knees, and closed his one good eye. Dutch civilians brought him water and bread. They had touched his shoulders gently, whispering thanks in a language he did not understand. Children stared at this strange soldier who had fought like 100 men. Women wept with relief that their families had survived. Men shook their heads in disbelief at what one person had accomplished. When Canadian troops finally entered Zwolle that afternoon, they found the city already liberated. The commanders who had laughed at Major's plan stood in the streets and looked around in stunned silence. Every bridge intact, every major building undamaged, 50,000 Dutch civilians alive and safe. One corporal sitting on the steps, too tired to even stand up and salute. The impossible had happened. Military doctrine said you needed 800 men and overwhelming firepower to take a defended city. Léo Major had done it alone with a Sten gun and the power of fear. The city of Zwolle did not forget what Léo Major had done. Within days, the Dutch City Council held an emergency meeting. They declared Major an honorary citizen of Zwolle, the first Canadian soldier to receive such an honor. They gave him the keys to the city in a ceremony where thousands of people gathered to thank him. Old men with tears in their eyes shook his hand. Mothers held up their babies so he could see the children who were alive because of what he had done. Young boys followed him through the streets like he was a hero from a storybook. Major was uncomfortable with all the attention. He kept saying he was just doing his job. He kept thinking about Arsenault, who would never receive any honors. The Canadian military did not know what to do with Major. On one hand, he had disobeyed orders and conducted an unauthorized attack. On the other hand, he had achieved something extraordinary. He had saved an entire city and captured valuable intelligence without losing a single Allied soldier besides Arsenault. The officers who had laughed at his plan now studied what he had done. They wrote reports trying to understand how one man had accomplished what should have required a full battalion. Major was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for the second time. This was one of the highest honors the British Commonwealth could give to a soldier who was not an officer. The first time he had been offered this medal, Major had refused it from Field Marshal Montgomery because he thought Montgomery was a bad commander. This time, the medal came from a different general, and Major accepted it, but he never wore it. He put it in a drawer and rarely spoke about it. When people asked him about Zwolle, he would change the subject or give short, simple answers. The memories of that night were too painful. Every time he thought about liberating the city, he also thought about dragging Arsenault's body into a doorway and leaving him there. After the war ended in May 1945, Major returned to Canada. He was 24 years old and had seen more death than most people see in a lifetime. He had fought at Normandy, Scheldt, and a dozen other battles. He had lost his left eye and collected scars across his body. He had killed more enemy soldiers than he could count. Now he had to figure out how to live in a world without war. Major married and had children. He worked as a pipe fitter in Montreal. He lived a quiet life and rarely talked about his time in the military. His neighbors had no idea that the small man who went to work every morning had once liberated an entire city by himself. His children grew up hearing only fragments of war stories. Major believed that the past was the past. There was no point dwelling on it. But Zwolle did not forget. Every year, on April 14th, the anniversary of the liberation, the city held a ceremony to remember what had happened. They invited Major to return, but for decades he refused. He said he did not need parades or ceremonies. He said the best honor was knowing that the people of Zwolle were alive and safe. The city kept inviting him anyway. They named a street after him. They erected a monument with his name on it. They taught their children the story of the one-eyed Canadian soldier who saved their grandparents. In 2000, when Major was 79 years old, he finally agreed to return to Zwolle. The city organized a massive celebration. Thousands of Dutch people lined the streets to greet him. Children waved Canadian flags. Veterans saluted as his car passed. Major was overwhelmed. He had not realized how much his actions meant to these people. He met families who showed him photographs of grandparents who had survived because of him. He walked through streets that still stood because he had prevented their destruction. He touched the bridges that would have been rubble if the conventional assault had happened. The mayor of Zwolle made a speech that day. He said that Major represented something important about human courage. He said that sometimes one person with enough determination can change history. He said that the lesson of Zwolle was not just about military tactics. It was about refusing to accept that bad outcomes are inevitable. It was about looking at an impossible situation and finding a different way forward. Major died in 2008 at the age of 87. The Canadian government gave him a state funeral. The Dutch government sent representatives to honor him. Zwolle lowered its flags to half-mast. News organizations around the world told the story of what he had done 63 years earlier. Many people heard about the liberation of Zwolle for the first time. They could not believe that one soldier had achieved what an entire battalion was supposed to do. But Major's legacy went beyond one city and one night. Military historians began studying what he had done. Special operations forces around the world analyzed his tactics. They realized that Major had accidentally invented a form of psychological warfare that would become standard practice decades later. The idea of using small teams to create the illusion of larger forces. The concept of psychological pressure being more effective than direct assault in certain situations. The understanding that fear and confusion could be weapons just as powerful as bullets and bombs. Modern special forces units still study the liberation of Zwolle as a case example. They teach it at military academies in Canada, the United States, and Britain. They use it to show that unconventional thinking can solve problems that conventional approaches cannot. They point to Major as proof that sometimes the textbook answer is wrong, and you need someone brave enough or crazy enough to try something different. The story of Zwolle raises uncomfortable questions for military planners. How many other cities could have been saved if commanders had been willing to try unconventional approaches? How many civilian lives were lost because generals insisted on following standard doctrine? How many soldiers died in frontal assaults when smaller, smarter operations might have worked? Major never criticized his superiors publicly, but his actions spoke louder than words. He proved that the rules everyone believed were necessary were sometimes just comfortable excuses for not thinking harder about the problem. Today, the city of Zwolle continues to honor Léo Major every year. A museum displays his uniform and weapons. Schools teach children about the liberation. Tour guides walk visitors through the streets where Major fought. The elderly people who were children in 1945 tell their grandchildren about the night they spent in cellars listening to one man fight an army. The city that should have been destroyed stands beautiful and whole, a living monument to what one person can accomplish. The deeper lesson of Zwolle is not really about military tactics or special operations. It is about human potential and the power of individual action. It is about looking at a situation where everyone says there is only one way forward and having the courage to say they are wrong. It is about refusing to accept that innocent people must die because that is what the planning manual says will happen. It is about the strange truth that sometimes the impossible only seems impossible because no one has been brave enough to attempt it. Léo Major was not a general or a politician or a famous leader. He was a small man from a poor family who lost an eye and kept fighting anyway. He was someone the military did not want at first and the officers did not trust later. But when 50,000 civilians needed someone to do the impossible, he was the one who stepped forward. He was the one who said he would do it alone. And against all logic, against all military wisdom, against all reasonable expectations, he actually did it. That is the legacy of Zwolle. That is what we remember. One person, one night, one impossible choice that saved a city.